Hello and welcome to the course Developing Soft Skills and Leadership through Indian Knowledge System. In today's lecture, which is titled Servant Leadership in Indian Traditions, we shall explore the concepts and particularly the kind of leadership which is presented through many Indian figures, particularly in Indian traditions. If we look at the theories of leadership across the globe, we find that in almost every culture and historical context, the concept and theories of leadership have evolved over a period of time. And if we look at particularly modern leadership, they have largely been focusing on or preferring rather amongst many types of leaderships styles and theories that exist. The particular theories that they have largely been focusing and preferring is the idea of ethical leadership, value-based leadership and servant leadership. So far as these concepts which are being preferred by modern theorists and the audience and the organizations, these particular kinds of leaderships figure largely and are being practiced in Indian civilization historically, and they have precisely emphasized on the idea of service, duty and compassion. Right? And we have in previous lectures have briefly been talking about the idea of service, duty and compassion, and we have related them with ideas such as Raj Dharma and Lokasaṅgraha amongst others. We have already briefly talked about Indian figures who have devoted their own entire life to the service and duty and compassion of the mankind, and therefore presenting a very comprehensive embodiment of what you call the leadership. Servant leadership therefore has deep roots in Indian philosophical traditions, which we have briefly talked about in previous lectures. And here particularly we will focus on this idea of what you call servant leadership. So before we delve deeper into this concept of servant leadership, we would quickly look at the term servant leadership and how it is being defined by people such as Robert Greenleaf, who has popularized this idea during 1970s, where he is trying to define this concept as the servant leader who is servant first and then probably thinks about his personal gains or personal prosperity. This idea of servant leadership is the one which begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first and then probably about to think about himself. Though we see that in the Western world, particularly through this case called Robert Greenleaf, that he has probably popularized this idea during 1970s. But if we closely analyze the historical realities of Indian context and Indian knowledge system, Indian traditions, you would probably find that this servant leadership has already been existing and being practiced by many Indian figures and leaders and kings and social workers at different points of time. Right? So we find that this idea of leadership is the one which begins with a natural desire to serve others, and which has largely been prioritizing the followers' growth. And we can if we just closely refer with this concept of how the servant leader prioritizes a follower's growth, we can have never a better example than of Lord Ram, who has prioritizes the followers' growth in case of Hanuman, in case of Sugriv and Vibhishan. Right, and how he has very precisely focused on the collective well-being of the entire subject that he was ruling not only as an authoritative power but more in a democratic way and ensuring the collective well-being. Right, he has throughout his life exercised the ethical authority over ethical authority rather than the exercise of power. Right. So we have an epitome of servant leadership in case of Lord Ram. In case of Bhishma Pitama also we have already discussed it briefly. We'll come to that in the later part of this lecture. So far as if you look at the idea of servant leadership, we find that there are certain major characteristics that this idea of servant leadership has been focusing on, and the first one is empathy. Whether the leader is in a position to empathize with his followers, whether he is in a position to identify himself in the what you call the self of the others, is he in a position to listen to the other people, the followers, the teammates, right, and then probably address their concerns, whether he is in a position to supervise and take care of his followers, that is called stewardship, and then probably community building. Is he in a position to build the community and take care of the community? And at the same time, he must have also a very dedicative commitment towards the growth of the others. And finally, ethical responsibility and humility must be demonstrated by a servant leadership. This is precisely what we have been defining the major characteristics of a servant leadership. And probably if you look at the cases from Indian knowledge system, we would probably find that these qualities resonate strongly with Indian philosophical and spiritual traditions, right. Particularly if you look at the case of Lord Krishna, we will quickly look at them. So, why should Indian traditions, how in Indian traditions the servant leadership is exhibited? We look at the concept of dharma, the concept of service and collective beneficial, right. We have already talked about the concept of dharma and service briefly. We will deal it with in detail in today's lecture, right. So, the servant leadership in Indian tradition largely is driven by the concept of dharma, or what we call duty. So, leaders in India, particularly exhibited through various kings, is being presented as a duty to take care of the subject, right. So, it's not a compulsion, or it seems to be a very ethical compulsion rather on the part of the leaders to take care of the subject, right, and they must dedicate their entire life to the service and collective benefit of the entire subject. So, therefore, we have four major concepts through which in Indian knowledge system, Indian tradition, the leadership is being viewed, and one is dharma, or which you call duty of the leader to take care of the subject, and he must serve, he must have a desire to serve the people, the general society. And we have already seen that leadership is not defined in a very confined manner in Indian traditions, because it is not limited to performing one particular kind of a goal, one achieving particular purpose, but in Indian tradition the work and the task and the action of a leader are associated with a wider reality of society at large, right. So, the leaders have a larger accountability and responsibility than a very specific purpose oriented to a particular group itself. Rather, it has a wider relationship and correspondence with a larger society at large, right. We have already defined this concept of Lokasaṅgraha when we are talking about general leadership, which is about the idea of welfare of the entire world, bringing about harmony and welfare of the people around you. And finally, we have Nishkama Karma, or selfless action, which is being delivered by Lord Krishna in Gita, where he has been talking about karma yogi, right, and how people should not be concerned about the results, rather they must perform their duty, selfless action, right. So, this is how leadership in Indian thought is being defined, which is largely a service to the entire society rather than the domination over the society, right. So, it seems to be guided by the principle of service than the principle of power and privilege and domination. Now, let us quickly look at certain examples that exist in Indian traditions. The first one is when Lord Krishna delivers this message in Bhagavad Gita, where has been which may be considered as a powerful model of servant leadership. What Krishna says is that karmarne vadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana ma karma phale hetu bhurma te sangagots karma vakarmani. So, that means you are the only thing that is at your part is, or your right is restricted particularly to work, but not to its results, and therefore you should not, or your action should not be guided by the result of the action. Rather, your motives should be attached with selfless action, or what you call you should not allow yourself to let your attachment to a particular thing lead to what you call inaction, right. So, what Lord Krishna here is presenting is a selfless action. That means you should perform a particular work not considering about its results, or that simply means like you should never look at any kind of personal gain or any kind of personal prosperity in any kind of work that you perform, but rather your part should be done in terms of performing the work. And that is why if you look at when Arjun asks Lord Krishna who is better amongst Karma Yogi, Jnana Yogi and Bhakti Yogi, right. Lord Krishna says that Bhakti Yogi and Jnana Yogi, they are concerned with their own enlightenment and their own transcendence, and therefore their actions are very personal, right, because they are engaged in transforming their own lives. But Karma Yogi is better than Jnana Yogi and Bhakti Yogis, because Karma Yogi is the one who is not only performing his work and transcending himself, but the entire world at large, right. So, the actions of Karma Yogi are associated with the welfare of the common people, and therefore, he seems to be better, right. And at the same time, he also says that this Karma Yogi is the one who is performing the action, but at the same time he is not involved in the action. It is a selfless action, right. That is why Karma Yogi is better. So, the focus is on performing your work not for yourself, but for others, and make sure that everyone is happy. And the kind of model that emerges from this particular sloka is the idea of servant leadership, right, where duty without attachment and this kind of leadership is represented through certain kind of examples, right. So, key ideas that we can derive from this particular sloka is the idea of Nishkama Karma, that is acting without selfless motives, and how this particular sloka is encouraging the leaders to act for collective welfare rather than personal gain, and this is precisely at the core of what you call the servant leadership. Similarly, the entire idea of Lokasaṅgraha, right, which is leadership for social welfare, and this is how it is defined in Bhagavad Gita by Lord Krishna, where he says karmanev hi sansida mastita jangadaya lokasangrahameva sampashna kartu maharshi. Right. So, here he gives the example of King Janak, right. He says that if you look at the life of King Janak, he is an embodiment of the leadership which he has completely done for social welfare and well-being of others, right. And that is why another name for Raja Janak is Videh, right, somebody who is not concerned about his self, right, rather his entire life is devoted and dedicated for the welfare of all, right. So, the concept that has been presented in Lokasaṅgraha emphasizes thus that you must engage yourself in maintaining social order and ensure collective well-being rather than concerning about yourself. So, the first motive of a leader should be to maintain social order and collective well-being, and you should be engaged in guiding society through a righteous action, because the leaders are always looked at as role models by common people, and therefore, you must demonstrate righteous action in your behavior, in your character, and thus you can lead the people and serve them at the same time. So, the idea that we derive from this concept of Lokasaṅgraha is that a leader must be in a position to act for the benefit of the society as a whole. Precisely the example of Janak, which has been presented right here, is the one which reflects the core philosophy of servant leadership, right. So, we can think about the model of Janak as an embodiment of what we call the servant leadership in Indian traditions. Similarly, if you look at the entire concept of servant leadership in a Hindu tradition, we have already talked about briefly about Lord Ram and how Krishna has been presenting, talking about that through the example of Janak, that how one should be engaged in what you call servant leadership. But at the same time, if you look at the case of Krishna, who has largely been considered as a transformational leader, but at the same time we also find that he is also the one who has been acting as guide and mentor to the entire Pandavas, and therefore leading them towards righteous actions. So, one of the forms of service to the common people can be performed in the form of mentoring and guiding towards righteous action. That can also be considered as a model of what you call servant leadership, which is being demonstrated by Lord Krishna, particularly while he has been guiding the Pandavas and mentoring and transforming Arjun in order to participate in the war of Mahabharata, right. So, apart from what you call Lord Krishna, if you look at many other examples from what you call the example of Dushyant, and you see that how this example can be seen as the king as protector of Dharma and ideal ruler serving the people, right, where the entire government is being carried out with a sense of moral responsibility. This is quite embodied and can be expressed to the concept of what you call Raj Dharma, right. That is a duty of a king to maintain justice with compassion, with a purpose in his mind to ensure the welfare of the entire subject. These are the kinds of leaderships. This is a model of servant leadership that emerges from the entire Hindu tradition. If you look at the concept of servant leadership in Buddhism, we look at that Buddhism has largely been focusing on the concepts of compassion, or what we call karuna, and wisdom or pragya, and then non-violence. Right. These are at the core of what you call Buddhist philosophy. So, Bodhisattva, for example, represents the highest form of servant leadership, because Bodhisattva is one which postpones personal liberation to help others attain enlightenment. So, the entire idea of Buddhism is placing yourself at the back and placing the welfare of the entire society at the front. This reflects the fact that leadership may be performed through compassion and service. Let's take the example of right action that has been popularized by Buddhist philosophy. Right action is the guiding people to do something which is at the benefit which is for the benefit of the entire society than of the personal benefit, and how you are going to guide the entire society towards morality. So, such concepts of Buddhism may be considered towards preparing an individual for servant leadership as such. Now, if you look at the concept of servant leadership in Sikhism, right, we know that the entire Sikh tradition is strongly emphasizing on the concept of Seva, which is called selfless action or selfless service, right. And if we look at this concept of Seva, that means if you look at the entire Sikh tradition, you would probably find that they are considering or worship as service, right. And this is very much what you call rooted in the concept of serving the humanity at large. So the entire idea of what you call spirituality and religion and worship, they are practiced in the form of serving others, right. And that is why the core principles that Sikh tradition particularly incorporates is the idea of humility, equality, and service to humanity, right. And you find that probably the concept of equality that is being practiced by Sikh tradition, where everyone seems to be equal, particularly in the religious places, right, is quite unique in Sikh tradition, right. And where service is placed at the highest pedestal, service particularly to humanities, right. And this is quite evident if you look at the concepts such as langar, right. Langar is nothing but a kind of servant leadership in practice, where you are serving. Langar is a kind of I think if you look at the concept of langar, that is serving the vegetarian food to a larger public free of cost and with a sense of service to the humanity, right. And if you look at this concept of langar, probably you would find that this is also a practice of equality, where each and every one dining during langar is coming from different backgrounds from the society, and everyone is treated equally, right. So that's a kind of a sphere or kind of a space where equality is being practiced, and at the same time service of humanity is also being practiced, right. So if you look at what you call the idea of Sikhism in India, one of the religions who has been practicing humility, equality and service to humanity, I think we can have never a better example than that of Sikhism. Now, if you look at the case of Swami Vivekananda, he has also been demonstrating the entire idea of servant leadership, right, and when he has established Ramakrishna Mission, and that is a kind of an example where he is placing more emphasis on the idea of serve man as God. They alone live who live for others. So, if you look at these two slogans, serve man as God, right, that means he is looking at divinity in human being, right, and is placing human being before any kind of self or any kind of religiosity. Rather, human being seems to be what you call first one to be served, and therefore in the next slogan, if you look at they alone live who live for others, is that the very very existence of human being is associated with the collective welfare, right. That means you exist as long as you serve others, you live for others, right. So, it is a very close correspondence between the individual life and the collective well-being, right, that is coming from Swami Vivekananda, and that is why his actions, particularly through Ramakrishna Mission and such slogans, we can infer this idea that he has been focusing on selfless service, social responsibility and moral courage that precisely can be derived from his articulations. Though he has been talking about many other things, but we can also see him as an embodiment of what we call servant leadership. Now, the question is, why should servant leadership be practiced, particularly in the modern context? Right? So, we have certain benefits that are associated with the idea of servant leadership, probably in the modern times, that practicing servant leadership may bring about trust within a particular organizations, right, where you can see the motives of your leader with a particular position, that he is here to serve. And we have certain examples as Tata, for instance, he is always trusted by his employees because they think that he is the one who is here to serve, right. It may also bring about employee satisfaction, right, and the entire organization may have ethical culture and sustainable growth, right. So, that is the reason why should we practice servant leadership, right. And if you look at organizations which are being led by servant leaders, they often experience stronger teamwork, greater commitment and higher productivity, right. So, it also results in what you call a greater output and better performance of the organization if a particular organization practices the idea of servant leadership. We have in Subhashitani Hitopadesh, it is said that na kaschit mitram na kaschit ripum vyaharena jayante mitrani ripva istatha. We can probably cannot find out who is a friend and who is an enemy, right. We can only differentiate between an enemy and a friend through the idea of the behavior or the practice that one performs, right. So, here we are associating this idea of servant leadership with soft skills, means you can make changes through your behavior, right. So, servant leaders probably develop certain kind of essential soft skills. That means the kind of behaviors, if we observe the behavior of a servant leadership, we would probably find that there are some essential soft skills which are inherent in the behavior of a servant leader, and that is emotional intelligence. He is in a position to have emotional intelligence, and at the same time he is also practicing empathy with others, and he has very strong communication and always practices ethical decision makings and involves in conflict resolution, right. So, these are the crucial skills for modern leadership, and this is something which has already been said in Hitopadesh, where the focus and emphasis has been on a particular behavior, right, and your behavior makes a difference whether you are being perceived as a friend or as an enemy, right. So, you must behave in a particular way where you must be in a position to exhibit the ideas such as emotional intelligence, empathy, communication, ethical decision and conflict resolution. If you look at the relevance of servant leadership in contemporary society, we would probably find that servant leadership is being preferred, particularly in modern times, in corporate governance, in public administration, education and community leadership, because people believe that servant leadership can really make a difference and transform the modern organizations. In an age of organizational stress and competition, servant leadership promotes ethical workplaces, inclusive leadership and sustainable development. Therefore, if you practice servant leadership, you can bring about a real change within your organization from the perspective of what we call the modern organizational context. So, if we try to integrate Indian leadership traditions in the what we call modern context, we would find that Indian knowledge traditions usually offer valuable insights for global leadership, because there are certain key contributions that Indian knowledge traditions have made to the entire idea of leadership, particularly servant leadership, and that is if you look at the cases of Indian leaders, particularly ancient Indian leadership, you would find that they have always exhibited ethics based leadership, right, and their purpose has always been oriented towards service. They always want to serve people, right. At the same time, the leadership in Indian context is highly rooted in the idea of spirituality, and they have always made sure to bring about certain kind of collective welfare. These principles can enrich contemporary leadership models, right. So, if we try to practice such leadership skills in contemporary times, we would probably find that the contemporary organizational models can really be transformed and certain changes may be brought about, right. For example, if you look at the case of Lord Krishna, if you assume the role of a mentor or a guidance or a guide, probably you can guide your team and the organization towards achieving a moral, ethical and right action, right. Or if you look at the concept of Janak, probably you would be in a position to perform your work without looking for any kind of personal gain, rather to make sure that the people around you grow, right. Or if you look at the case of Lord Ram, you would probably be in a position to make sure that you bring about allies and these allies also have certain kind of growth along with you, right, and they can be exhibited in the case of Sugriv and Vibhishan and others. So, in conclusion, if we look at this entire concept of servant leadership in Indian knowledge system, we would find that it is not merely a modern management theory, it is deeply rooted in Indian philosophical traditions. We have in the very beginning of this lecture already said that probably this concept of servant leadership in modern management theory could have been popularized during 1970s, but if we look at Indian philosophical traditions, we would find that this idea of servant leadership has been present since ever, right, and Indian leaders, particularly if you look at the cases of Lord Krishna or Lord Ram, or if you look at the cases of Bhishma Pitama, or if you look at the cases of Janak, right, they have already been present in Indian context, where these leaders are largely being guided by the idea of Dharma or a kind of an ethical duty to serve the people, right. Or the Indian leaders have always practiced what we call Nishkama Karma or selfless action, where they have not been expecting any kind of personal gain or personal prosperity while performing a particular work. Rather, their work is always guided by the sense of performing work without any gains, right, and therefore probably for collective well-being, right. And similarly, this concept of Lokasaṅgraha has always been at the core of the performance of Indian leaders, where they have tried to bring about the concept of Lokasaṅgraha, and that is harmony and welfare of the entire society at large than the personal gain as such. And they have all, not only the ancient leaders in India, but also different kinds of religions are such as Sikhism are largely invested in the concept of what you call Seva, or service to humanity at large, service to humanity without any discrimination, right. So this is how we have seen that this Indian knowledge system has been deeply rooted in the idea which are being presented as Dharma, Nishkama Karma, and Lokasaṅgraha and Seva. Let's quickly look at the example of Bhishma Pitama, right, and how he has devoted his entire life to the service of not only the throne of Hastinapur, but also to the collective well-being of the entire subject of Hastinapur, right. And I know at the cost of sacrificing any kind of personal gain that he could have achieved very easily, right. So Bhishma Pitama's life is, I think, the best ever example of the embodiment of servant leadership if you look at the entire Indian tradition, right. So if we closely look at the Indian knowledge system, it provides a timeless insight into leadership as service, as responsibility, and moral commitment, right. So what we have seen is that in Indian knowledge system, the certain leadership models have been presented, which are quite timeless, and which can be employed in order to address the modern challenges of leadership, which are largely guided by authoritarianism, right. While the the models that have been presented in the knowledge system are can be invoked in order to address such issues, right. We have in the previous lecture we have talked about Duryodhan as a model of autocratic and authoritarian leadership, right, and one of the factors of why Kauravas have lost the war of Mahabharata despite having such a huge and strong army is probably the kind of leadership that is being presented by Duryodhana, which is quite autocratic, authoritarian, and invested in power and privilege, right. And how servant leadership in contrast is the one which is being practiced by what you call Dharmaraj or Yudhishthir, and guided by Lord Krishna, have probably swiftly won the war of Mahabharata because probably of the leadership qualities invested in Yudhishthir and Lord Krishna. Thank you for listening to me patiently. In case you have any doubts or questions, kindly let me know. Thank you.